During 1966 to 1967, MichelFoucault presents the notion of heterotopia on three separate occasions. He discusses it firstly in his preface to his book The Order of Things, secondly within a radio broadcast devoted to the theme of utopia, and finally in a lecture presented to a group of architects in 1967. Of Other Spaces is taken from these unpublished lecture notes and explain his spatial theory of heterotopias as hybrid sites that undermine stable relationships, disrupt conventions of order, and dismiss straightforward categorization. Heterotopias reflect a curious movement between the familiar and the unfamiliar. According to Foucault, Galileo's studies suggest that a thing's place was no longer anything but a point in its movement. This set the stage for Foucault's heterotopian theory, which argues that spaces are constructed around relationships and interactions with sites, both physical sites and sites in time. The remainder of the paper discusses the various characteristics of heterotopias. Foucault argues that such spaces are universal and necessary components of human civilization, but that their function shifts over time in response to changing culture. Heterotopias are often linked to slices in time. Museums present a space for the indefinite accumulation of time, while festivals are transitory heterotopias that frame the experience of the intermediate and transitory. In both cases, they present a space apart from the traditional time of their enclosed in cultures. Heterotopias are both isolated and accessible, public and hidden. They enable us to both confront our illusions and to create new illusions of the utopias we cannot have. Foucault concludes his paper by remarking that the ship, without its shifting relations and meanings, is the mother of all heterotopias, and that in civilization without boats, dreams dry up, espionage takes the place of adventure, and the police take the place of pirates. Here we find ourselves in a college, a perfect heterotopia that links slices of time and knowledge through the accumulation of history into one place. At the same time, we are aware of the technological advances of the 21st century that surround us. Had Foucault been alive to witness the emergence of cyberspace, he might have identified certain online spaces as heterotopias as well, and observed that they are proper to Western culture and time-bound to today's world. To illustrate how heterotopias are created, I'm going to hand you over to the rest of my group, who will create a heterotopian cyberspace right here.
Michel Foucault was a French philosopher, or more specifically, a historian of systems of thought. He is considered and thought to be the most influential social theorist of the second half of the 20th century. Through his impressive career, Foucault became known for his many demonstrative arguments that power depends not on material relations or authority, but instead primarily on discursive networks. He published numerous books which appeared to be unconnected, such as The Care of Self, Discipline and Punish, History of Sexuality, Volume 1, and The Care of Self, Discipline and Punish, and History of Sexuality, Volume 1. Looking closer and discovering more about Foucault, his ideas and philosophies, there is one recurring theme: the struggle of individuals against the power of society. But these texts juxtapose a lecture Foucault gave in March 1967 and was later published by a French journal in 1984. The text of Other Spaces was a detailed explanation of a heterotopia and hybrid space.
Foucault believed between the countersites of an enacted utopia, heterotopias, and the utopia itself was a joint experience, parallel to that of the mirror, contrastingly to the predetermined notion that utopias are something that are not physical within reality. MichelFoucault jests with the notion that the mirror itself is in fact a utopia. The mirror is, after all, a utopia, since it is a placeless place. The mirror, although only marginally dissimilar, opens up a virtual three-dimensional counteraction of the position in which we occur. For the instantaneous moment of reflection, the space in which we occupy is absolutely real, in relation to the other spaces which coexist around it, but absolutely unreal, as in order for this to be perceived, it has to pass through the virtual point which is over there. Inherently, there has been a permanent segregation of individuals whose concentrated behaviour is outside the boundaries of acceptance. These external heterotopic spaces accommodate the uncustomary intrinsic spaces. In modern communities, these external spaces are termed heterotopias of deviation. For example, psychiatric hospitals and prisons. superimposed upon previously established heterotopias of crisis. Almost irrelevant, heterotopias of crisis, these privileged sites of permission, are reserved for individuals who are, in relation to society and to the human environment in which they live, in a state of crisis. The dynamic alterations of shared attitudes brought about crisis heterotopias' irrelevancy, excluding the military service. These sites accommodated, as illustrated by Foucault, the desire for the manifestation of sexual virility to occur from outside the home. The configuration of significant events on a temporal axis can resultantly affect the precise and determined function of an already established heterotopia, based on the synchrony of the culture in which it occurs. Its utility can be uprooted and transformed. MichelFoucault validated the principle through the tangible space of the cemetery, unconsciously connecting individuals through the common historical paradigms of death rituals. During the 18th century, the cemetery was the nucleus of the societal settlement, manifesting within itself a hierarchy of terms of burial aesthetics, something that was maintained despite the revision of its function. Incongruously, as a modern society, which breeds the load of aesthetic importance, we have generated a cult for the dead attitude. Throughout the 19th century, society began to propagate the attitude that death had the ability to cultivate disease among the living, theoretically as a result of individualization of the burial of remains. Ideals in terms of the proximity to which both spaces could coexist led to the relocation of the cemetery to the community's furthest parameters. The term heterotopia was first employed within the preface to The Order of Things. Originally through the term heterotopia was also used in the medical area, wherein which a particular tissue develops at a place in the body from which it should not. Ectopic tissue is the biological tissue's ability to diversify in function at its non-physiological site, while still coexisting with the original tissue at the correct anatomical location, consequential in the form of a heterotopia. Alterations in the function of anatomical and behavioural traits are evident during evolution, similarly fostered by the varying demands of the environment in which they support. Mary Jane West Airburd's Developmental Plasticity and Evolution discusses the obscure novelties that transpire from the development of evolutionary lineages, the charted change of orientation of a feature. Feathers classically illustrate congenital exaptation. Initially evolved from heat regulation, the organisms themselves exploit their visual quality for display and later for the use of flight. Comparable to the role of the cemetery, the change is brought about by the prominent role of control that dictates that given space.
Principle 3 is introduced with a sentence. Heterotopias are capable of juxtaposing a single real place, several spaces, several sites, that are in themselves incompatible. He uses the cinema, the garden, and carpets as examples. Firstly, the cinema literally creates illusions that make us question our apprehension of supposedly real spaces. One sits in a room, like this one, with a 2D screen on one side, like this one, exhibiting a three-dimensional entity like this. In this scenario, people are in a real room with a real 2D screen, and on this screen is an artificial representation of a 3D entity. Next, he refers to the sacred Persian garden, of which its 4 parts represented the 4 parts of the world. The centre of the world was embodied by a basin and a fountain. Finally, flora within the garden would tie everything together, forming a model cosmos. Carpets were originally woven to recreate the garden ground, designed to be placed in the home, creating a portable heterotopia. The 4th principle is in 2 parts. Heterochronia, spaces of indefinitely accumulating time, in an immobile place, and then temporal heterotopia, spaces in which time is in its most flowing transitory state. Heterochronies are museums and libraries. Take, for example, the British Museum or the Tate Modern. Spaces where time never stops building up and topping its own summit. History is constantly being found, gathered, made, and documented. Therefore, artifacts are constantly being hoarded.
The second type of time in heterotopias is temporal time, like festivals and resort towns, for example, or a music festival that will exist for a certain amount of time, that will bring certain people to a certain place. The second type of time can also be ephemeral, temporary, like festivals or resort towns, for example. A music festival will exist for a certain amount of time that will bring certain people to a certain place that would otherwise not normally exist together in that time and space. And while at this place with a time limit, according to Foucault's definition of heterotopia, people in attendance will forget about time while experiencing a new sort of knowledge that is basic and transcendental of time.
The fifth principle determines what qualifies a person for entrance or exiting of the heterotopia. They have secured entryways or require rituals for entrance, and they manifest a system of apertures that is both accessible and exclusive from other spaces. Access is limited and not open to anyone, and one must meet a certain criteria to enter them. Take, for example, the King's Cross campus at St. Martin's. To access anyone of the public can access the reception, the restaurant, the foyer, but as soon as you get to the barriers, you meet a certain blockage. As long as you have an ID card, you can access the student campus. As a student, you then have to enter different workshops, but you are only limited the amount of workshops that your course does. And this is a perfect example of the fifth principle of a heterotopia, a secured entry and a ritual to get in. Another example is the internet. Again, anyone can initially gain access to the internet itself, but to gain access to a certain website, you may have to meet certain requirements, such as pornography. You will always have to be over a certain age. You may have to pay a membership fee or wait to be accepted for a membership. Another example, a games arcade, where most of the machines are 18 over for slot machines, but they have a different space of the arcade for kids, for example, dance machines and army games and so on and so forth. But the main aspect of the fifth principle is a ritual and the opening and closing of a heterotopia.
The sixth principle says that heterotopia function in relation to every other space, and there are two types, illusory and compensation. The illusory exposes every real space, for example, drag queen cabarets, which are real places, but also fictional. It is not how the rest of society works or lives. It is enacting a fantasy, dressing up as a woman in exaggerated characteristics, which exposes the superficiality of what women are expected to be like. So it's exposing that truth. Other examples Foucault gives in his lecture is that of the brothel and the American motel, places that function outside of normal society, and the activities which take place in shows the truth about the world outside the world, what people are like, or something like what they value. The other type is compensating heterotopias, which are places that are perfect reflections of society. It is making up, compensating for society's imperfections by perfecting them, like the example of the Jesuit colonies in South America that had perfect symmetry and order, which Foucault referenced in his essay or lecture. Everyone followed a strict set of rules, woke up at the same time, ate breakfast at the same time, went to sleep at the same time, all according to a bell's ring. However, this heterotopia's perfection is uncomfortable to live in, since it's so strict. Therefore, it allows one to imagine a utopia, which makes it a heterotopia.
Heterotopias of art. Shady Gahandrian's like everyday series of work provides the first of two examples that I'm going to present to explain how Foucault's theory of heterotopias can be used to contextualise art in terms of time, place, and cultural spaces. As we have heard, heterotopias open up different slices of time and incorporate these slices into one space, in this case the burqa. The burqa is inextricably linked to certain spaces in time, times of day implied by the household object, and times of life, that of public time and private time. The burqa encloses a space that is available to the public only at select times, fulfills the fifth heterotopian principle, in that they have both closed and open systems of access. Certain people are never allowed across the spatial threshold of the burqa, while those who are permitted to do so for very specific reasons. The burqa performs a specific ritual that has predetermined functionality. Thus, the burqa in Gahandrian's work is a pervasive, exclusive, and ritual space. It has all the characteristics of a perfect heterotopia. The Like Everyday series juxtaposes historical and cultural slices in time against modern-day conveniences and attitudes within the Islamic culture. The image seemed to describe the psychological space of a woman's changing identity through time and humorously takes issue with the traditional roles by which Middle Eastern women are often defined. The principles of heterotopia are fully illustrated as Gahandrian's characters break with their historical, time-bound and constrained cultural spaces and meet with 21st century expectations of women. Gahandrian's photographs utilise the duality of the burqa as a site fixed in time that represents purity and modesty, but when juxtaposed against the unexpected contemporary, vibrantly patterned fabrics, allow each portrait to suggest a vivacious individuality and character that contradict the limitations of a stereotype that is so firmly rooted in history. The mundane objects used to express the personalities of the women when transformed into faces become highly expressive and charismatic hetopic caricatures, which illustrate Foucault's fourth organising principle of heterotopia as a site that has the ability to reference multiple spaces in time and history. Shady Gahandrian's photographic work creates heterotopian spaces that dissect time and collate history through the use of imagery that both challenges and amuses. Similarly, the bonds of site to cultural history are represented by the topiary effect in the sculptural work of artist Hugh Locke. Locke's work follows Foucault's notion that heterotopian sites have strong ties with culture. Locke anchors the history of topiary as an art form that represents nature in a controlled and perfected way and contrasts it with socio-political concerns alluded to through the structure and materials in his sculptures. The built nature of Locke's sculptures, Black Queen and El Dorado, alongside the excessive use of artificial materials from around the empire, layer the pruned topiary. They are heterotopic as they displace the original site and concept of topiary into a contemporary critique of power and control. If you apply the Foucaultian principle when analysing Black Queen and El Dorado sculptures, it appears that Locke's intention was to marry contemporary socio-political commentary with a history of topiary as a very Gentile British pursuit, and by using materials synonymous with many cultures, Chinese plastic trinket toys, samurai swords, Indian ceremonial daggers, connect the far-reaching power of the monarch with many real geographical sites, and through the representation of the Queen create a new space, both physically and intellectually, a heterotopian space. The heterotopian space that each of these pieces of art creates are literal and metaphorical constructions intended to challenge our ideas of time and space as well as notions of power and subjectivity. The site of these work represents the heterotopic space that offers transformations or ruptures from ordinary existence. The burqa confirms and at the same time disturbs our understanding of identity. Sculpture gives a new shape and meaning to the familiar. The topiary-affected spaces created by Locke and the cultural spaces created by the burqa in Gahandrian's work are representative of how Foucaultian principles of heterotopia can be followed to apply new interpretations to site and space-specific artwork. To conclude, Foucault argues that heterotopian spaces are necessary components of society, but their function shifts over time in response to changes in culture. Since Foucault's Of Other Spaces lecture, we have experienced the development and transition of a heterotopic society, but Foucault's spatial theory is perhaps much wider and deeper than he acknowledged, as it offers us a different style of thinking. Foucault's theory and philosophical principles can be applied to our understanding and appreciation of artwork, both through viewer-sensitive heterotopic spaces and through the sighting of artworks in both physical and chronological spaces within our contemporary and historic culture. I think Foucault is proposing heterotopian thinking as a form of spatial understanding, but I suggest the application of his theories is far greater. I think they provide a way of contextualizing experiences, attitudes, and events, and is this not what much art tries to do? Have you ever gazed at an art object and been drawn in by it, been sent mentally reeling into a space of mind totally disconnected to your surroundings? What is that artwork then if not heterotopic sight that permits you to access its spatial network of thought, discussion, criticism and debate?